Afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first installment of our Canadian IGF Talks speaker series. Does the Government of Canada still support the open internet? I want to let you all know that at the outset, we'll be recording today's session as we are live broadcasting on YouTube. Et de plus, pour les spectateurs qui veulent regarder en français, appuyez sur le monde et choisissez français. My name is Byron, Holland, and I will be your moderator for this session. I'm the president and CEO of the Canadian Internet Registration Authority, or CIRA, and we sponsor today's event. For those of you who are new to CIRA, we are the national not-for-profit organization best known for operating the .ca domain space on behalf of all Canadians, but we also provide a multitude of cybersecurity services, including our free Canadian Shield service, which protects Canadian households from malware, phishing, and other cyber attacks. As well, we operate our community investment program, where we donate a percentage of our operating revenue back into projects that help promote a trusted internet for all Canadians, including the Canadian Internet Governance Forum that you're all here to participate in today. So welcome. I'm going to take a moment to set the stage for our panel discussion and then hand it over to the panel. But first, a couple moments just to level set and get everybody up to speed. Throughout the past year and a half, the internet has certainly become a vital resource for all Canadians. We all knew it was important, but the past year and a half has certainly held that in sharp relief. And the government also has recognized this. As we've been working, learning, playing, connecting, and shopping online, the government has been actively working to address some of the internet's fundamental challenges. And three pillars of the Canadian government's internet policy agenda include, first, Bill C-10, an act to amend the Broadcasting Act, introduced last November. Two, expected legislation to address online harms. And three, new efforts to support journalism in the digital age through copyright and link licensing. The overall policy priority of Heritage Minister Stephen Guilbeault, who is in charge of much of this digital policy file, has been to level the playing field between Canadian media and what he calls the web giants like Facebook, Google, and the other platforms. Now, the first pillar of this digital policy, Bill C-10, aims to promote Canadian content, or CanCon, online by requiring online undertakings, such as Netflix, YouTube, TikTok, and the other big platforms, to finance and promote CanCon on their platforms through terms set by the CRTC, or the Canadian Radio and Telecommunications Commission. The second key pillar, combating online harms, has seen the Minister Guilbeault and Justice Minister Lametti introduce a bill to criminalize hate speech online. They will also be releasing a technical discussion paper for regulatory framework for dealing with online harms, with new obligations for social media platforms pertaining to harmful content and speech. The third pillar of the digital policy package includes efforts to support Canadian journalism in the online world, where digital advertising revenues are primarily dominated by Google and Facebook. Right now, the Senate is exploring reforms to the Copyright Act to support journalism. And Minister Guilbeault has discussed the intention of creating a link licensing scheme for Facebook and other social media companies to pay for publishing news on their platforms. And finally, I'd certainly be remiss if I didn't mention Canada's Privacy Reform Bill, C-11, which was introduced by our former Innovation Minister, Navdeep Bains. As many of you are aware, Bill C-11 did not pass the House of Commons before Parliament rose for the summer, and it's likely to die on the order paper should a fall election be called. So that provides an overview of the Canadian digital policy context, and we're going to jump right into some of the substance. So when the Canadian Heritage Parliamentary Committee agreed to remove Section 4.1 from Bill C-10, a clause that would have exempted user-generated content from regulation. It kickstarted a massive debate about the government's support of freedom of expression and net neutrality. The controversy around Bill C-10 offered, I think, a preview of how internet users, network operators, tech companies, civil society organizations, and others feel about the government's digital policy agenda. And that's why we're here today, to discuss whether the digital policy package is supportive of the principles of the open internet, or if the government should rethink their approach to internet regulation. And right now, I'd like to introduce you to today's, if I may say, awesome panel of experts on these subjects. Ms. Janet Yale is an industry veteran who has served as an executive VP at TELUS, as CEO of the Canadian Cable and Television Association, and recently served as the chair of the Broadcasting and Telecommunications Legislative Review Panel. Ms. Laura Tribe is the executive director of Open Media, a grassroots organization working to keep the internet affordable, open, and surveillance-free. And Professor Michael Geist is the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law and a law professor at the University of Ottawa. And finally, Mr. Daniel Bernhard is the president and CEO of Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, a not-for-profit group that represents citizens who care deeply about Canadian media, journalism, and programming. So today we'll have a moderated discussion with some questions that we prepared ahead of time, followed by an open audience Q&A. So get your questions ready. You can use our Q&A functionality to ask your questions, as those sent in the chat will not be monitored. So just to be clear, we have a QA application that we ask you to use, not the chat function. In that application, you can upvote the questions you'd like to see answered by clicking on the thumbs up under each question. And that allows everybody online, in turn, to essentially surface the most popular questions. As well, feel free to follow the discussion on Twitter by using the hashtag CIGFTalks. CIGFTalks, all one word. So before we begin, I'm going to run a quick poll to see whether you think the Government of Canada still supports the open internet. A polling question should pop up on your screen, and then we're going to run the poll again at the end of the session to see if any of your answers have changed. So feel free to answer the poll, please. You should see it on your screen now. Without further ado, it's time to begin the moderated portion of today's event. So we have four groups of questions that we'll be working our way through over the course of the next hour. And the first question is, there are growing concerns about the power and influence of big tech platforms. There's been action in the US and the EU to combat their influence. What does reining in big tech look like to you? How should the Canadian approach differ from what we've seen around the world? And what assurances do we see from the Canadian government that its approach will be compatible with principles like net neutrality or freedom of expression? Now, I'm going to hand this question first to Laura and then ask Daniel to follow up and/or rebut. And Laura and all participants, I would ask you to keep it to 3 minutes and kick it off for us. Laura, what do you think?
Thanks. I mean, this is a really big question, and I think that's going to be the challenge we face in the entire conversation today, is how to try and narrow it down. So I'll do my best for 3 minutes. I think, looking at this question, it really starts with the idea that big tech has too much power and is fundamentally too big. And I think that's where the entire basis of all the issues that we're talking about today start from, is who has the control and who has the power. And I think when we talk about big tech, it's really important to be clear about who big tech is and who we're talking about. So, traditionally, when we're talking about big tech in the global context, it's really looking at Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft. In Canada, a lot of the conversation, as we'll get to in some of the other questions and topics, really includes platforms. We're really talking specifically around things like Netflix and Spotify, including them in that debate. What does streaming platforms look like? But I think it's important to not lose sight of that really big tech question. And what power and influence do they have that we're concerned about? And I think, there's a ton of different concerns people have, but really big picture, it's money, particularly the topic of ad revenue, it's market share and the influence that they have from that. And it's the access they have to consumers through the integrated platforms that they have. So when we talk about the tactics in Canada and what's happened in the EU or the US separately from what Canada should do, the approach in the EU has very much been to regulate them. And very similarly, we've seen some of those tactics in Australia around regulation to try and rein in the power of those companies. I think in the EU, two really big examples that we've seen are the copyright directive, which really looks at how do you actually require these companies and these platforms to both pay into and police on behalf of other industries. And then you have things like the GDPR, privacy law, which provided incredible privacy protections to residents of the European Union. On the flip side, when you look at the US, they're really coming at it from an antitrust framework, that these companies are too big. They're looking at how do you break up and spin off portions of these companies? How do you look at interoperability and data protections for consumers? In Canada, there's been a bit of a different approach. So I think to date, so much of the conversation in Canada, when we talk about big tech, has really been, how do we take advantage of that power instead of how do we rein in that power and rebalance the scales? And I think when we look at things like privacy in particular, when we talk, as you mentioned earlier, Byron, around Bill C-11, assuming there's an election in the fall, it's dead on arrival. It was a half measure at best when it was introduced, particularly when compared to the GDPR in Europe, and it was not a government priority. And so I think the tactics have been really a lot less about how do you empower citizens, how do you empower internet users, and a lot more of how do we actually take advantage of that power for the different industries and interests that these, that the government is taking on. And I think it's important to note that it's not a standalone issue in Canada when we talk about concentrated power. Big tech is not the only oligopoly in town. The Canadian government in particular is incredibly comfortable with concentrated power. If you look at our media companies, our telecommunications companies, oligopolies are pretty accepted by this government. And so I think the issue here, at least from the government's perspective, is not the concentration itself. It's that someone else is even bigger than our guys. And what are we going to do about that? So when we're looking at a Made in Canada approach, yeah?
I'm going to have to rein you in very shortly.
That's okay.
Final comment?
I think when we look at a Made in Canada approach, we really need to be looking at what is the final product that we want and working backwards instead of really trying to piecemeal solutions for the current problems that we're facing.
Thank you. And now I'm going to pass it over to Daniel.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks, Laura, for your insightful overview, I think, of the international scene. You've spared me the need to provide a lot of context, so appreciate that. I think that we all support the idea of a free, fair, and open internet. And your original question, Byron, I think was very good. How can the government of Canada keep or support an open internet? And I think in order to do that, though, we need to realize that where we are right now, the internet is not free, it's not fair, nor is it open. It's not free in the sense that you pay for these services with obscene amounts of personal data, the disclosure of which you can't consent to. It's not fair in the sense that all the rules are governed by private companies that are not subject to the rule of law in many cases. And it's not open because, as Laura mentioned, a handful of companies control the vast majority of our experience on the internet. So when it comes to looking at policy that affects the internet, I think the first thing we have to realize is that the internet of 2021 is not the kind of idyllic, optimistic internet of 1996 or 2002. It is the opposite of that. So as for the general principle, the way that I see it is that we should just start by trying to apply the law. A lot of what these companies do is not novel to the digital realm. We have rules for this. And the issue is that these companies may not be able to operate according to the rules. I'll give you an example. There's a large market of third-party sellers on Amazon who are selling drugs and things like this. It's already illegal to sell drugs and to facilitate the sale of drugs. There's been this issue of child sexual abuse material on Pornhub, a Canadian company. People are saying, what are we going to do about this child porn online? It's like, well, why don't we follow the laws? We already have very strict prescriptions against this. So the first thing that we can do to rein in big tech is to acknowledge that, on one side of this equation is a sovereign government, and on the other side are corporations with their own interests. And if Canada behaved as a sovereign country, we would make sure that these companies paid taxes like everyone else, that they followed the rules like everyone else. And when we talk about media in particular, that they, make their fair share of contributions like everyone else. The Broadcasting Act, Bill C-10, has been an interesting flashpoint, because I think we need to recognize as well that the vast majority of these companies are media companies. They are selling advertising against attention in the same way that television and newspapers and radio and others have in the past. And so this model is not novel. Facebook and Google through YouTube are major media companies. Apple and Amazon have been spending billions of dollars to become major media companies. So a lot of what we're talking about does involve our media law. And again, equal application is the way to go in my mind. So when you talked about the controversy around C-10, Bill C-10, in my opinion, was very badly drafted. The Heritage Minister was not well equipped to defend his own bill or changes to his own bill, which makes the problem just infinitely more complicated. But the general principle of equal application of the rules, I don't think should offend us. And that's, I think, where we should be looking. If we apply our laws equally to companies like YouTube and Facebook, as we do to other media companies, what would be the implications of that? And I don't believe that the implications are the sort of doomsday scenarios that have been floated around. So I'm happy to be able to get into this. But yeah, first principle, long story short, to answer your question, let's apply the laws. We have plenty of them that are just not being applied right now, and the consequences are pretty negative for our society on the whole.
Thanks, Daniel. Interesting comment. You don't often hear it said in polite company that our internet is neither free nor fair nor open. I'm interested just to pick up on a final, or one of the latter points you made, Daniel, around just apply the laws that we have. Michael, you have commented often about the laws that we have vis-a-vis the internet and the importance of judicial oversight in some areas of this conversation, maybe a little bit of a stretch from here, but I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on what Daniel's just said?
Well, I agree with him. It's one of the first times I start off by saying I agree with Daniel, because sometimes we disagree on stuff. But you know what? I think that he's right when he says that there are any number of different laws that are out there that can be applied. And I'm sometimes puzzled by the government's insistence, especially the heritage ministers, that he's got to rewrite everything and reestablish all sorts of new rules. I mean, certainly some of the online harm stuff is a pretty good case in point, where they were appearing before committee talking about the kinds of things that they thought they needed to do when the focus on illegal content is illegal. And if they were seeking to apply some of those rules already, I think that we'd be far more effective. But I also think that we haven't had in Canada a particularly sophisticated discussion about the differences between these players. I mean, with respect, big tech and this attempt to call them either big tech or web giants or web behemoths really misses the point. I mean, there's a fundamental difference between selling products on Amazon and user-generated content on YouTube and a curated video service on Netflix. And I think one of the problems that we've had with the current minister and with the government government's approach generally is that they felt that there is political wins to be had simply by painting big tech with a single brush and suggesting that so long as you're taking on those companies, you've got a political winner and you're moving in the right direction. The reality is that there are different issues. There is a commonality for some issues. I think data privacy is a common issue that cuts across those companies. I think tax is a common issue that cuts across those countries. I think competition is a common issue that cuts across those companies. But once we start getting into some of the other kinds of issues, and that's where I think the flashpoints have been with either legislation or legislative proposals, these companies are not all the same. The legislative approaches should not be the same. And the government's lack of sophistication in being able to engage in, I think, a real discussion about that kind of nuance to address the real world implications of some of their proposals, both the benefits but also the harms, has often been what's missing and what I think part of the outcry over C-10 was about.
Thanks, Michael. And I think that, and Laura kicked us off with, I think, a really important distinction there, and that is the distinction between big tech and platforms, which can be the same, but are also different and require potentially different solutions. Janet, I'd like to bring you into this, particularly given the legislative review process that you chaired. When you think about the big tech platforms and how that was relating to broadcast, what are your thoughts on what you've heard in the last few minutes, but also some of your thoughts about what do you do with the incredible power and influence of big tech, I'm going to get trapped here, of big tech, be they just large technology companies or the platforms themselves providing content?
Well, I'm going to surprise you by saying that I agree with quite a number of the points that have been made in the sense that I really liked, Laura, the way you talked about the issue of power and control. Because when we sort of started our work, one of the things we had to confront is to what extent do we, as Canada, how do we deal with global companies? And to what extent should there be laws of general application, sector-specific laws in a context where these companies are subject to different laws depending on which markets they're operating in? And how do we think about not sort of telling them how to conduct their business, but nonetheless having terms of trade, if you will, terms of engagement with Canadian consumers that allow us to dictate at some level the way in which they conduct their business in Canada, whether it's privacy issues, whether it's antitrust issues, whether it's about their media operations, whether it's about hate speech. I think we really struggled with this issue of power and control and not being afraid, even though we're a small country, to assert jurisdiction based on the kind of company we're talking about. I agree they're not just tech giants. It depends what kind of business they're in. But to not be afraid to come up with legislative regimes that make sense for Canada and Canadian consumers, and not to be worried that they won't operate in Canada. They'll take their toys out of the sandbox and go elsewhere, because at the end of the day, they won't. I think they demonstrated that they'll push pretty hard, but then once the rules are in place, they'll play ball by those rules, and they're just trying to make sure the rules are as flexible as they would like. So those are very much the kinds of issues and concerns that we were preoccupied with when we were thinking about how to approach legislative reform.
Byron, do you mind if I follow with just a quick comment?
Yeah, please jump in.
Yeah, I think, Michael, there is one thing that unifies all of these companies, and it is what Janet just mentioned, which is that by virtue of the fact that they operate on the internet, they consider themselves not to be subject to the will of Parliament, and sort of kick and scream and are talking about special accommodations. So no matter their business, yes, Amazon and Netflix are providing very different businesses. Well, if you don't count the TV part, they are the same in that they consider themselves to be operating outside. And so the real question is the question that Janet raised, which is, how do we assert sovereignty over these companies and say, this is our country, it should be able to run in the way that we, the people, through the will of Parliament and moderated by courts and constitutions and other institutions, decide. And I think that is the unifying factor, and that's why they do sort of fit together in one conversation. The applications can be unique, but the principle has a common origin.
Michael, I'm going to give 30 seconds because then I want to come back around the horn to Laura to ask a final question on this one before we move on.
Sure. In 30 seconds, it's just nonsense, Daniel. The notion that these companies don't think that Canadian law applies is just not true. We've had companies like Google before the Supreme Court of Canada. We've had Facebook dealing with the Privacy Commissioner now for more than a decade. They may not agree with some of the rules, but the idea that they think that they're sovereign and aren't subject to the rules is just not true. The problem is that we've had through something like Bill C-10, it's not that we don't think that we can apply our laws to big tech. We think we can apply our laws to literally any company anywhere in the world offering audiovisual services. As Senator Simon said, where do we even think that we have the moral right to suggest that any service anywhere is somehow subject to Canadian rules? And if you don't think that many of those kinds of services that play an important role from both a competition perspective and a choice perspective will say we are not going to enter the Canadian market, we are not going to service Canadians if we face these kind of regulatory impediments, I think you're dreaming. I mean, the reality is we are setting up a great firewall in effect with these kinds of rules, which will lead to less choice and less expression in the Canadian internet.
Thank you, Michael. Laura, you started off delineating the difference between EU and US, and I think just tapping into the last 2 points that have been made. You touched on Canada and you referred to, EU regulates, US coming at it from antitrust, Canada trying to take advantage of the scale of these organizations to rein them in. If you were providing the advice to the government today, how should they be redoing or recrafting this legislation?
I mean, if we're looking at C-10 specifically, I think it's really based on hitching their wagon to the success of big tech, full stop. And I think that's where they've gone awry or astray. I think when you're looking at Canadian laws, when you look at things like the Competition Act and the Competition Commissioner's powers, we're looking at one of the largest mergers in telecommunications history between Rogers and Shaw, and no one's certain they're going to stop it. Like, there is a deep comfort with oligopoly and concentrated power that full stop drives this belief that we can just piggyback off of the biggest and most successful. And I think the entire philosophical approach to this, reining in companies versus what do we actually want the end game to look like, is that we need to start with, what do we want Canada to look like at the end of this? What is the competition we want? What are the choice of providers? What is the innovative environment for where is the new Netflix coming from? Why isn't it going to start in Canada? How do we make sure that we're in an environment that has the opportunity for Canadians and our creators and all of the different tech startups, instead of trying to regulate to entrench the incumbents now to just perpetuate more, bigger status quo? And I think that's kind of the philosophical kickstart to the rest of the conversations that will ripple into broadcasting or telecommunications or any of those other pieces.
Thanks, Laura. And actually, that's a great segue. So that concludes the first package of questions we had. We're going to move on to the next one. And Laura, that was a great segue because this is much more C-10 specific. And the question is, critics have said Bill C-10 will reduce freedom of expression and choice, while proponents say it will increase choice in Canadian content. The bill aims to do this by making Canadian content more discoverable through terms set out by the CRTC somehow. How does this affect user-generated content? What does it mean for the Canadian experience online? And quite frankly, is it even practically possible? Janet, I'm going to ask you to speak first on this. 3 minutes, please. Because I know there's a lot of opinions on this and we want to make sure we have room for everything. And then Michael is going to do the follow-up before we open it up to the rest of the panel. Janet, what do you think?
Well, Michael already took a stab at making it clear what he thinks of Bill C-10. I think I want to not focus on some of the specifics about the legislation, but I do think it's a false dichotomy to say we have to trade off between freedom of choice or freedom of expression and having Canadian choices. It's a false debate. And it misses, in my view, the fundamental question that we were asked to address and that Bill C-10 was designed to address, which is to ensure that there is actually a place for Canadian choices and voices as part of our Canadian cultural identity. And I think that's the real issue that's at risk that nobody talks about. And it's why I think that C-10 was well constructed in terms of just updating the legislative framework to say that online media services would be brought into the legislative framework in a very simple way, in the sense of they would be registered, subject to exemption for smaller players, and be required to make a fair contribution. That's all that C-10 proposes. It's way less restrictive than previous forms of regulation. It's not saying what genre of content, what business model. All it says is if you are operating in the Canadian market as a streaming or a sharing service, you have to make an appropriate contribution. It does not target individual users because in programs are audio or audiovisual content, but the programs themselves aren't subject to regulation. So individual users posting things are not regulated. What it does say is the undertakings, the online undertakings that offer these services must be subject to regulation. So no one's going to tell you what you can or can't post on Twitter or YouTube or any of that, or otherwise interfere with people's freedom of expression online. It's simply the case that the undertakings in question, and there are people in the business of providing streaming services or sharing platforms or whatever, have to make an appropriate contribution. And that's the thrust of our recommendation. That's the thrust of C-10. We can get into what does discoverability mean? What does promotion of Canadian content mean? But the notion that these services should be exempt from the requirement to contribute is just inappropriate in a world in which this is the technology that is used to carry content, just as we went from radio to TV to satellite, cable along the way. It's not saying we're regulating the internet. It's the undertakings that offer audio or audio-visual content online. These undertakings, just like undertakings that use different technology, have to make a contribution to Canadian content and ensure that there are, in a world of endless choices and voices, no restrictions on who can access what from anywhere in the world, Michael, but that there are Canadian choices for people to enjoy. I think that would be my opening comment.
Thanks, Janet. Michael, when I listen to Janet, that sounds very reasonable.
Yeah, it does. The problem is that's not the concerns with the bill. So if that was the limit of the bill, I think that some might say that it is reasonable, although I think we could get into a discussion first as to whether or not Canadian content really is at risk. The reality is that there has been in recent years record amounts spent on the creation of Canadian content, whether that is CanCon or the production of content in Canada. Either way, we've seen record amounts of it. The notion of not contributing, Netflix says they've spent more than $2 billion on licensing and production in Canada. That strikes me as pretty significant investments in the country. And when we talk about equal sorts of contributions, the reality is there are an assortment of benefits that the regulated sector gets that streamers don't. So I do think we could get into some of those underlying issues, but that's not why so many Canadians, including senators like David Adams Richards, one of Canada's best known authors, Scott Benzie, who I see in the chat representing many digital first creators. That's not why many of those from the creative community and many others spoke out against this. They spoke out against the bill because it isn't limited just to those kinds of services. First, as I mentioned a few moments ago, it does incorporate quite literally any audio-visual service. And I'm sorry, there are limits to how far Canada's laws, much less the CRTC, ought to be able to extend its regulatory reach, and that will have an effect. It'll have an effect both in terms of services that decide to enter into the Canadian market. It will have an impact on the affordability of those services, because if we layer in taxes and new 30% costs, I got no problem with the tax side, but if you're heading towards a 50% increase in the amount of expenditure some of these services are going to face, we know it's the consumers that will ultimately pay the price, and that will result in less choice because it simply won't be affordable anymore. But even more, this legislation initially excluded user-generated content, both in terms of regulating the user and in terms of regulating the content itself. The government removed, as many people will know, one of those exceptions, so that section 4.1, the effect of which was to essentially treat anything that's audiovisual as a program potentially subject to regulation. CRT, the government then said, okay, fine, we will limit the scope of some of these regulatory powers, but in doing so, and in taking on this so-called discoverability issue, what the government did was give the CRTC the power to begin to prioritize, or even more important, deprioritize certain content. That really concerned many digital-first creators who feared that they would be left out and those Canadian voices would be deprioritized, which is unquestionably a real-world risk as part of this. And so there are those kinds of genuine sorts of concerns of once you insert the government into deciding and into making some of those kinds of choices. And we never heard a good explanation from the government as to why they decided to extend into that. And let's be clear that while you started earlier by talking about how are different countries addressing these issues, when it comes to this form of user-generated content, there is no country in the world that sees fit to do this. Nobody even knows how you'd characterize or categorize that content to even make this sort of thing work, and to inject the CRTC. Think of where we are at with the CRTC led right now by Ian Scott. Is this the sort of commission, the sort of agency that people would trust with making those kinds of determinations? I'd suggest to you the answer is no.
Thank you, Michael. Janet, I
need to
got something to say.
it. I mean, where to start? First of all, the fact that Netflix or other streaming services spend money in Canada is because they get service tax credits and the benefit of the Canadian dollar. It's not Canadian content. It is spending in Canada. That's great for employment. And whether or not, however we debate what the rules of Canadian content should be, Canadian content, the key creative positions have to be held by Canadians. They're spending a lot of money, and that's fantastic. It's great for the economy, but that's not ensuring that we have Canadian content. And Michael, no matter how many times you try and twist that around, it's not. And the only way that's going to happen is through regulation. And those companies know it. Secondly, I would say that these are spending requirements. I would argue that for companies, for the streaming services, they can easily accommodate within the envelope of their spending a manageable amount. And as yes, to be determined by the CRTC, the way they've set the rules for every other undertaking that is in the business of providing audio or audiovisual content. And it is not a complicated thing to do. These are spending requirements. There's no genres restrictions. There's no packaging restrictions. There's no exhibition requirements. It is a simple spending requirement where they have to ensure that the key creative positions are held by Canadians. As far as the foreign services are concerned, and the concern that these small undertakings won't enter Canada, as I've said before, you have to be an undertaking. And just like in other parts of regulation, there are exemptions below a certain revenue threshold. You and I have had this conversation, whether it's in law or in regulations, there would be an exemption saying that below a certain level of revenues earned in Canada, you have to actually be earning revenues in Canada to be subject to the requirements, but below that revenue threshold, you would not be subject to regulation. This is about the bigger players, and to worry about the small players, they are not going to be the target, and it would be absolutely anticipated. We said it in our report that you would want to encourage, as you said, third language small undertakings to be able to reach Canadians in large numbers. And I don't think there's anything in this legislation that would have put that at risk. As far as the social media services go, I agree with you that there is an awkwardness in the way that that was put into the legislation. I think while the intent was clear to capture the platforms, not the users, I think it has gotten confusing to be sure that it is not the users that would be captured in any way.
Thank you, Janet. Michael, I know you've got a response, and then I do want to bring in the other panelists because I know they're passionate about this one too. So Michael, over to you.
Yeah, very quickly, because I want to hear absolutely what Laura and Daniel have to say. First, I mean, frankly, just factually wrong, Janet. I'm sorry. Netflix has paid for and created Canadian content, which qualify as CanCon under any definition, except for the fact that they happen to own it. So when they're funding kids, when they're funding things like Trailer Park Boys or Juste Déclin, a Quebec-based French language film that ticks all the boxes you just mentioned, but still doesn't qualify as CanCon. They did it without regulation, without the requirements to do it. The reality is they do engage in that kind of spending, and it's wrong to suggest otherwise. Second, it isn't this kind of money they're already spending. You had the Heritage Minister claiming this was costing Canadian creators $70 million a month. If this legislation was going to pass. It was just a completely fictitious number, but it's quite clear that his expectation was that this was new money. He kept saying $830 million a year in new money that would be put into an envelope that these companies would not be spending. It's not their existing revenue. That might be what your report called for. That's not what the legislation happened to call for. And so that's, I mean, I think we ought to make that clear. And if we did want to exclude some of these kinds of companies, then why not establish some of those parameters in the legislation? They didn't do any of that. They said it's forthcoming in a policy direction, and then the policy direction didn't contain any of those sorts of details. I'm sorry. The reality at the moment is that Canadians' trust in the CRTC has ebbed at an all-time low. And this kind of uncertainty and this regulatory reach around the world and saying, oh, well, that's just the way we do it, I'm sorry, isn't good enough. It adopts an approach that says we regulate everything and we'll wait till later to figure it out. I think it's a mistake.
Laura, I'm just going to ask you to pause for 1 second. Janet, do you have a quick response to that?
Well, I mean, you know, Michael always takes the exceptions and tries to make them the rule. So he comes up with shows where the IP was not owned by Netflix, and comes up with examples of cases that should have been counted as Canadian that weren't. Obviously, the CanCon rules would have to be adapted in this new environment because these undertakings are not Canadian licensees. That doesn't change the point that they have to, that there is some content for sure that would meet Canadian content requirements, but that's the exception, not the rule. And what we're worried about is the declining health of the Canadian broadcasting system. The broadcasters absolutely do not think that they have benefits that outweigh their obligations. That's why they're asking for a lightened regulatory load. And in fact, the only way to ensure that over time that we're going to have a vibrant Canadian cultural industry is to include online undertakings in the legislation.
Laura, I can't help when I listen to this and think about the things left undone, to put it politely. A tweet you wrote that says, you know, Guilbeault's efforts to rush C-10 through now mean promised amendments to fix what the government itself broke are now null and void. And all we're left with is a truly appalling half-finished bill. I'm wondering, are these the kinds of things that you were thinking when you wrote that?
I mean, I think, it's always good to have your tweets quoted back at you. You know, I think watching the process of this bill really gets at, I think, a lot of what Michael and Janet are talking about. There's real discrepancies between what we were promised, what was intended, and what the outcome of the bill is. And a lot of that, I mean, as Daniel himself pointed out, like is the minister's fault. It's the government's fault in how they handled it, how they drafted the bill, and navigated it through, and trying to rush it through. You know, the process, watching them trying to get it through Parliament, was a complete train wreck. It undermined absolute faith in our own government to pass its own legislation. In trying to rush it, they hamstrung themselves in trying to introduce their own amendments. It was really disturbing. But I think, you know, big picture, to pick up on something that Janet said, you know, talking about Canadian content as creative positions held by Canadians. As a big part of that, I think one of the things that we're hearing a lot of at Open Media is, what is Canadian content? Because if this is to continue to prop up and promote what CanCon is, we're out, because the current system doesn't represent Canadians. And there's a big difference, and I think it gets used a lot in C-10 between cultural policy and industrial policy. Is this about jobs or is it about content? And they get used against each other whenever it's convenient to conflate one with the other. But when you're actually looking at, jobs, actual people working in the space, then yeah, Netflix making content in Canada counts. They are using Canadian creators to make that content. If you're talking about cultural representation, if we don't think that our artists are being given that support, and we want to expand all of that legislation to look at online content, what about all the online creators? We're talking about expanding the definitions of CanCon to apply to things like YouTube. Everyone who has made YouTube such a success in Canada has done so by the exclusion of the broadcasting system. They have had to turn to YouTube or other online platforms because they are not welcome in traditional media. And so as soon as we make those platforms expected to look and feel the same way that we see on cable TV, where do those voices go? We hear a lot in the bill, we've heard a lot from the minister around how this is going to protect and promote Indigenous voices, marginalized communities, and yet that's already in the existing Broadcasting Act. And where's the support for those communities? They've had to turn to online platforms. And I think without any clarity in Bill C-10 around what the new versions of Canadian content looks like, what a Canadian creator is, that's why you're seeing online creators so scared, because they feel like, traditional media is coming for them to take their place with nothing to actually support them in what they've built themselves. And I think that's a really big gap in this conversation around this bill, is what is Canadian? How do we define that? Because the current system is leaving a lot of people out.
Thanks, Laura. Daniel, CEO of Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. When you listen to that, what are you thinking?
Well, I think a few things. First, I think there's a general argument that's being made, which I don't quite accept, which is that until we've solved all the problems, we can't solve any of them. Laura's right. The definition of Canadian content, in my mind, is insufficient. Actually, Friends just published a paper about it called Broadcasting a Reflection. You can check it out at friends.ca. But just because we have more work to do doesn't mean that we shouldn't do any. I think let's talk about C-10. And for all of the people who are worried about C-10, and Michael gave a very impassioned, might even say exercised response to this bill today. If you're worried about that, oh boy, wait until you see the current Broadcasting Act, which is still the law. And now that C-10 has been effectively defeated, will continue to be the law for the foreseeable future. The current Broadcasting Act allows the CRTC to regulate any audio-visual content on any medium. It makes no distinction between analog and digital. It provides no carve-outs or exemptions at all for individual users or social media users or social media platforms. It gives the CRTC basically full discretion to do just about whatever it wants. Now, the CRTC has exercised restraint in this, in my mind, actually too much restraint. Like, for example, they could have asked Netflix to make these types of contributions many years ago, and they simply elected not to. So if you're worried about the CRTC having too much power, you should be worried about the existing Broadcasting Act. That's the first thing. And yet the sky has not quite yet fallen. As for some of these other economic arguments, I don't quite agree. I mean, Michael mentioned a movie from Quebec that Netflix has done. That's the only movie that Netflix has done in Quebec. And they didn't make it in the absence of regulation. They made it to fend off regulation. This is part of a general PR strategy. But overall, if Netflix is spending $2 billion on Canadian content, then that's great. They should have nothing to worry about. They're already meeting the requirements. So what's the problem? These are why some of these debates I find to be a little bit overheated. And the final thing that I'll say, I mean, there's just there's so many places to go. But the final thing that I'll say is when we talk about social media, this is one of the things that was, I think, badly done, as everyone here has said, in the Broadcasting Act. And social media service, which is the sort of term in the act that has become the center of all this controversy, isn't even defined in the act. That goes to show you, how ham-fisted the drafting was, and how thoughtless in many cases the bill was. But I'm not here to defend the government. I'm here to talk about what I think, is a necessary principle. And, we are not talking about controlling what social media services become. Laura's point that YouTube should become more, look and feel more like broadcast television, I think is not true. There's a recognition that these services are ascendant and that they are the main means by which Canadians get media. And there have been historical examples where companies have been forced to make or promote Canadian content, and that people actually like it. And once it's made, companies like Netflix are picking up these shows and these movies after the fact. And so we are simply saying, as Janet said, that there should be some choice. And obviously the economics are less desirable for a company like YouTube or Netflix if they have to feature Canadian creators. It is an encumbrance, but no one is suggesting that they should look and feel like television. In fact, there is an opportunity, because they're digital, because they're infinite, because of all of the different characteristics, for them to be very different to conventional TV. And I think that's a good thing. We just think that, there is a space for Canada there. And I will just say that this argument is not new. Since the very beginning of broadcasting, if you go back and look at the debates around the very first Broadcasting Act in the 1920s, the first Broadcasting Act was passed in 1932. There were people who were saying, "Oh, it's fine. We were happy getting shows from the U.S. Amos and Andy was the big show. That was the center of all the controversy. We don't need to have parochial Canadian stuff being forced on us." This is a conversation that's happened for a long time, and the historical record shows, and the music industry is the best example of this, that when broadcasters have a requirement to highlight some Canadian voices, not only do those voices step up, but actually consumers enjoy it. So there is nobody is proposing, and I am certainly not proposing, that YouTube should become more like Global or CTV. That is not the case. We're talking about these companies having equal responsibility. And this is one area where I find it very problematic, and I'll end here because I know others want to get in. We talk a lot about censorship. That's been the word that's been used all the time. Restrictions on free expression, censorship. And we're not talking about censorship. We're talking about a very conservative limited government principle, actually, which is just personal or corporate responsibility. If you are responsible for circulating content that happens to be illegal, and I'm not talking about this awful but lawful, I'm not talking about mean content, I'm talking about illegal, you should bear the consequences for that. If I send a op-ed to the Globe and Mail saying that, all the Jews should die or something like this, I am free to do that in many cases. As a Jew, I would hope that it doesn't happen, but I am free to do that. They're not going to put it on the front page because they know that they would be responsible for that. And companies like Facebook basically say, if you consider us to be responsible, then we wouldn't be able to operate. And this is the issue. These companies are recommending this content, they are promoting this content, they are personally catering it to each and every person, and yet they say that they shouldn't be responsible. That's what we're talking about, not censorship, responsibility.
Okay, I'm going to have to call it there for you. Given this particular topic and how I know our audience wants to hear more about it, I'm going to let this run a little bit longer, which will of course impact our next question. But Michael, I want to hear from you on that. And then Janet, I want to give you the last word on this topic before we move to the next subject.
Sure, just a couple of points. I mean, that felt like a total bait and switch, where we start with C-10 and the concerns around user-generated content, and suddenly now Daniel's talking about Facebook and anti-Semitic content. I mean, this is just
that's user-generated content.
We're just talking about. No, I'm sorry. We can talk about online harms and those kinds of issues. This is not broadcast, and this is supposed to be a broadcast bill. This is not supposed to be a bill that addresses, as you suggested, every single thing under the sun, including those kinds of harms. The question was whether or not this applies in a broadcast context that way, and I don't think it does. But I have to say, I mean, a few times now I'm hearing, oh, this is overheated or being exercised. damn straight, I get exercised and overheated, as do a whole lot of Canadians, when we get both legislation that moves into this kind of regulation of user-generated content in this way in an unprecedented manner. Quite literally, countries such as China and Pakistan don't even think this is appropriate, and yet it's what we do. You want to talk about saying, let's treat these companies more like broadcasters? Well, at least have that kind of discussion. User-generated content isn't that. At least have a process where you actually include those creators. You didn't have digital-first creators. You didn't have consumers be part of any of those sorts of discussions. And I'm going to get very exercised about a policy process that was embarrassingly supported by any number of people who should know better, where debate was cut off, where Liberal MPs were even overruling their own chair to bring forward amendments that had never even been made publicly available to anyone, and then voting on that, voting on legislation at the end of the day at 1:30 in the morning. That is not the way that I think that you go ahead and engage in this kind of legislation. And and to my surprise, but I think real happy to see that senators from across the spectrum recognize the inadequacy of that. And if Canadians aren't going to get exercised and heated about a policy process that gets supported by cutting off debate when freedom of expression is part of what's being discussed, well, what on earth are they going to get exercised about?
Janet, final word.
Thank you. I don't want to get into the parliamentary process. I think, Michael, you've made some really important points on that. I guess the thing I wanted to come back to, what the legislation started as was a way to bring online streaming services into the cultural policy system in Canada. And I just want to leave social media services aside for a second, because I think the case for the streaming services is much clearer. Those who curate content like Netflix, Amazon Prime, and so on. And I think the bill was very strong in that part of it, in terms of being not looking back regulation. It wasn't trying to say we're closing our borders. We're not trying to create a walled garden of content. We're saying, let all these services come in to Canada. Let's not interfere with the choices they make about their genres, their business models, the way they organize themselves, who they package with, who they partner with, whether they create the content themselves or buy it from others, whether they do the productions in Canada or around the world, whether they subtitle it, dub it, whatever. That's backward looking. So the legislation said, we're not doing any of that. All we're saying is you have to contribute a certain percentage of your revenues, advertising or subscription revenues earned in Canada, to the creation of Canadian content and then promoting it. I just want to say one last thing that we didn't have a chance really to discuss. There are really only two models for doing this. Neither of them are new. One is spending, and the streaming services were going to be subject to a spending requirement. That's it, right? The other model is what I call tax and grant. They get assessed a levy. The levy goes somewhere. Michael, you said many times, it's so simple, just tax them. The problem isn't the tax part. The problem is the spend part. If you have a tax and spend model, which is the Canadian Media Fund, and I chaired the Canadian Television Fund before it became the Canadian Media Fund, the granting part is incredibly complex, incredibly fraught, and you need an agency or a body of some sort to administer it, to determine eligibility, to determine who can take what money out, what the percentages are for English, French, Indigenous, third language, whatever. And so, I stand behind the view that the spending model for these online undertakings is looking forward regulation, as opposed to the old style model of making these choices and determinations about what content gets created by whom and in what proportion. So I think while we've had a long conversation about what Bill C-10 is and isn't and what it should and shouldn't have been, I think the principle of spending obligations for online undertakings is the right one.
Byron, can I add 30 seconds on price? I promise 30 seconds.
Daniel, you don't have a good track record on brief.
So watch me. So
30.
We talk about the implications on these services for price. I would just say that there have been misleading terms like Netflix tax, which were thrown around for many years, which was just sales tax actually, and that this was going to make Netflix unaffordable. In the time that we've been having that debate, Netflix has raised its prices 3 times and Canadian subscribership is at record numbers. So this idea of price hikes making services unaffordable doesn't seem to have borne out.
Pretty close to 30 seconds. Thank you, Daniel. Which, you know, that's a great conversation. And I can see just from some of the chat, you know, how much our audience is appreciating it. We are going to move on to the 4th question, and I'll probably have to compress it a little bit to make sure the audience Q&A gets its fair share. But I think the pricing conversation actually is a great segue into our 4th and final question, which is, there is no doubt that traditional news media are, by and large, in financial distress. The government has offered several proposals for how to address this, including through copyright and everybody's favorite link licensing. The Senate is, or at least was, exploring an approach to supporting legacy news organizations through amendments to the Copyright Act. What do you think of the proposals for supporting news media? What would you like to see? And Janet, I'm going to ask you to kick this off for us, and then Laura for your response. Janet, over to you.
Thank you. And I'm glad we're changing topics. I think it's time to talk about something else, but it is interesting that the premise of the question is that news media needs financial support. When we talk about audio and audiovisual media, we don't assume that those need support, which is what we've just spent the better part of an hour doing. But I obviously do agree that financial support is needed for media, for news media. And I think it's really clear to me that with the declining health of our news media industry, the job losses, the number of community and local newspapers that have folded, the lack of local media coverage. Certainly my personal view is the best way to ensure a healthy democracy is to have access to diverse, trusted sources of news and information. That's the best way, in my view, to address misinformation and fake news. So what do we do to generate the kind of money that we're talking about to foster a strong independent news sector? I, think that if the market can come up with solutions, that's great. And I was kind of encouraged by the recent announcement by Google to create the Google News Showcase, where they are going to license content from certain publishers and ensure that they are compensated for the content that they provide behind their paywall. And it's certainly an option. I know that some aren't really supportive of that, but the advantage of an approach like that is that it allows different platform providers to have different business models. So the business model in Google News Showcase might be different than the business model that other platform providers might choose to do. But the question still remains, if there is no deal, if a deal can't be reached because of the relative inequality of bargaining power between the publishers on the one hand and the tech platform on the other, what's the right approach? And I would have to say, just to kick it off, I quite like the Australian model as the most viable option of the one we've seen. Because it does two things. It allows the publishers to make arrangements with the tech platforms, and in particular allows them to negotiate collectively, something that might otherwise be considered contrary to competition law. So it allows for collective negotiations. And secondly, it provides binding arbitration, mandatory binding arbitration, if the parties can't agree. So it builds on this notion that there must be a deal. It has to be fair and appropriate. But if the parties can't agree, then there is recourse for them to find a solution. So maybe I'll leave it there for opening comments.
Thanks, Janet. Laura?
I think this is where Janet and I will start to disagree a bit heavier than we were in the past. When we look at the future of news, I do agree that there's a need for support for the news. I think the problem is that when we look at the solutions on the table that Canada is looking to copy, either from that of Europe or from that of Australia, they do what we've been debating and what I've been raising flags about this entire time. They hitch our wagons to the continued growth of these big companies. So if we go with something like the Australian model, not only, I think as we saw with Facebook for some time actually threatening to withdraw news from the country entirely because the terms were so hard for them, whether you take that at face value or not is up to you, means that there's now a gap in how people access the news. And that's a huge concern. If you look on the flip side of something like what's been done in Europe and what's been done in Spain and Germany and how that's handled when you look at the copyright approach, essentially what it's doing is saying headlines and all those little snippets and previews that you see when you see an article on Facebook, before you click on it, that becomes copyrighted. And those platforms need to pay for it. And I think what we're really missing is that we're making the public interest piece more expensive. And when you look in the really big context of what we're trying to get at, it's how do you get people to access the news, to read the news, and to support that to continue to exist. And there's a funding model that we're looking at putting forward of how do you make sure that there's kind of a wealth transfer from the biggest over to these companies that we think need to be continued to supported. But when you're actually looking at, from a user perspective, why would these companies continue to promote the news? Why would they show up at the top of your algorithms when they're more expensive to show? What is it in for these companies? Nothing. And so from a user perspective, all that does is mean I'm more likely to see misinformation on my newsfeed than I am to actually see the news. And that's the exact opposite of what we're trying to do and support our public interest industries like the news. And when you look at putting forward either of those models, at the end of the day, it doesn't get those companies what they need, which is actual sustained support. If you think, as we started this conversation with, that these companies are too big. If we tie our media industries, our news industries, our art and culture industries, all to the continued growth and success explicitly of companies like Facebook and Google, what happens if the US passes antitrust legislation and these companies are broken up? We've just dismantled our entire arts and culture sector. We've just dismantled our news industries, and that's out of our control. And so I think when we're looking, I know you take issue with Michael's proposal, Janet, but I think when you look at that kind of tax and grant system, it gives the control to the government. It puts someone in the middle to say, we think this is important. And it's hard. And the way they've done it so far to date has been bad. The media bailout that they did with the $600 million was hugely criticized. But all of these proposals being put forward continue to make the big bigger. The gaps we have are in local independent news. The way that these systems work is that for the amount of clicks or views your story gets, you get more money, which means how are these new startups going to exist? How are the local news outlets, the independent online outlets going to make it in comparison to someone like the Globe and Mail or the Toronto Star who can afford to put those ads up, to make sure they're getting those clicks, to make sure that their content is more and more popular? And I think, again, it perpetuates the big getting bigger and the small getting kicked out. And it really misses the point of who we need to be supporting.
May I just
very much. Look, you know what? I
just
hate
2 minutes.
I hate to do this because these are some great conversations, but we have a whole audience who has a bunch of really good questions that they want to ask, and we're going to get to these. Your 2 interventions there are spurring questions from the audience, which let's get to that because I'm sure we're going to come back around and talk more about this final question. It's always a balance between let the good conversation go, which I did, and making sure we have enough time for Q&A. So we're going to head over to Q&A now. And, first, let me just say to the panel, thank you for an incredibly insightful, thoughtful, and passionate conversation. I think that's exactly what our audience signed up for. Our educated audience learned a lot today. We already have some good questions lined up, and we're going to head over to the Q&A section right now. As I said at the beginning, the audience can upvote questions to become what are considered the most important questions by the audience, and then we'll kick them to our panelists. So the top question right now is for you, Janet, and it's, what is Mrs. Janet Yale's definition and official opinion about net neutrality?
Well, certainly, if you look at our report, we were very strongly of the view that net neutrality is an important principle, and that that there should not be any interference with the way in which content is carried over the internet. I don't think I've ever had a different view of it, and I don't see anything in Bill C-10 or otherwise that would jeopardize that perspective. So I'm not sure where the question is coming from, but I am a very, very strong supporter of net neutrality and non-discriminatory carriage of content.
Sorry, Michael, a follow-up there?
Yeah, I have an idea where that question is coming from, because I suspect it's coming from, at least in part, Minister Guilbeault when talking about the critics. I mean, he went through this progression that it was just a bunch of radical extremists, so to speak, that were against the bill. And then it was people that somehow favored net neutrality, that somehow if you were in favor of freedom of expression and concerned about the overreach of C-10, you were in favor of net neutrality. Well, I mean, I suppose guilty is charged, because, yeah, I do support net neutrality. And as I noted at the time, I thought that the government did as well. In fact, in your report, Janet, you argued, I think rightly, that we need to be thinking about a more expansive vision of net neutrality, but that there are a number of different participants in the ecosystem beyond just the pure carriers that have the ability to interfere with content. And that is precisely why C-10 raised net neutrality concerns. So you're not sure why it's a concern? Well, it's a concern if you have a broadcast regulator, essentially the government, interfering with the prioritization of some content. It's deciding who gets to see what content gets prioritized, what content gets deprioritized. That sure feels very consistent with the concerns around net neutrality. It may not be Bell or Rogers or TELUS that's interfering. Instead, it's the Canadian government, but that doesn't really provide me, I think, or anybody with much of an assurance.
And I just think that's a cultural policy issue, not a net neutrality issue. I think, the way in which carriers of content have to ensure that they are not favoring some content over others because of commercial or other interests, and the right for information to be carried on an open internet. I really don't see your point as a net neutrality issue, and I know we just disagree on that.
But we have had the CRTC, sort of quickly, Brian, we have had the CRTC get involved in exactly those kinds of issues. It sometimes does involve content around net neutrality, where you have, various cases talking about, lowering the cost or limiting the costs of data on certain kinds of content over others. That is exactly the same kind of issue. It's saying, it's essentially, do you have some kind of intermediary in a position of control making determinations about what is likely to get prioritized or deprioritized? Well, that's what C-10 effectively did. And that's what your own report recognized was a potential risk in this emerging environment. It's discouraging to see you put it in the BTLR and then abandon it once the government put forward C-10.
Anyway, you and I disagree on this. I think there is, I am a strong proponent of net neutrality, and I do believe that the carriers who have these obligations to carry content in a non-discriminatory way, based on their commercial interests, is different than whether or not there are policy or regulatory reasons as to why we might think about carriage differently. The net neutrality principle flows from carriers giving themselves a preference when they're both in the business of carriage and the provision of content. So maybe I'll leave it there, Byron, because there are many other questions.
Thank you. Laura, are you going to answer this question?
I think the question also stems from the fact that in our very first question, you asked us about net neutrality and we never actually talked about it or answered it. So taking a step back from Janet's particular position or definition of net neutrality, which is a question itself, I think the biggest concerns that we're hearing from our community is really that in principle, the concept of net neutrality is around content being treated neutrally. And the way this government has handled C-10, the way they've talked about it, in addition to online harms and a lot of the other issues we're talking about, is that they don't view content as neutral in the way that they talk about it. And I think that's where, when you see Minister Guilbeault use net neutrality as some sort of insult at some point and then turn around and say he stands in support of it, that's what's really got people's backs up, is that it's really confusing messaging, and it doesn't match kind of some of the previous talking points we've seen from the government. So just to bring it full circle to your first original question, I think that's where it was coming from.
Thank you. We could have obviously spent the entire 90 minutes just on net neutrality, but let's move on. So the next question from our audience is, has anyone considered that instead of reining in web giants, we should instead focus on leveraging them to make Canadians successful worldwide? YouTubers are able to leverage them and grow worldwide audiences. Why can't that be done for others?
I mean, I'll kick it off, which is Canadians are already doing that. You know, we've seen stats that the majority of Canadian YouTubers' audiences are international. And I think the real challenge and the real issue with the way that a lot of the policies are being crafted to support the transition of legacy media to online services is not helping them transition to what's helping them export it. So much of the content CanCon requirement discussions are really designed around this idea that we need to build this wall around Canada, because what if other stuff gets in? And we really forget that actually we have a lot of really good stuff to send out, and we have a lot of great content to share with the world. And you can't have it both ways. You can't build this wall and only throw your stuff out and expect nothing to come back in. And there's not, I would say there's not enough faith in our Canadian artists and creators to make globally competitive content. And I think when you look at the track record of our creators on YouTube, on TikTok, they're already doing that. And I think that that's exactly the philosophy we need to take, which is how do you support our artists and creators for telling Canadian stories, but sharing them with the world, not just trying to share them only with Canadians.
Yeah,
But Laura, that's exactly the way in which our report assumed YouTube would support Canadian creators. It's not about walling content or keeping things from coming in. It's about how do they spend money, because it was a spending requirement, supporting young Canadian creators and allowing them to find audiences externally. There's nothing in our report or C-10 that runs contrary to that. That's exactly the philosophy. It's that we are in an open, borderless world, and we should celebrate that.
But it's not. This isn't a.
I think
it's not a monetary issue. This is. Sorry.
Go ahead, Michael.
I was going to say this isn't about whether or not YouTube contributes. The whole point is that there are these creators out there. They are successful. They want to they want to be displayed globally, and that this parochial view of let's in the Canadian YouTube world, let's prioritize some of those creators, deprioritize other of those creators, misses that for many of those creators who are successful now, who are not part of these larger cultural lobby groups that keep insisting that they know best, their audiences are often globally, and this sort of prioritization is just doesn't help them at all. In fact, it could hurt them in their own jurisdiction. And to the question of has anyone considered whether or not we can better promote globally, the answer is you bet there is. It's the former Heritage Minister, Melanie Joly, and she got demoted for it because that was her vision of how we ought to do this. And instead, she gets demoted. We get a different Heritage Minister who wants to put up the walled gardens instead.
That is an unfair characterization. It's not walled gardens. There is nothing about a walled garden, and I think it's a real misrepresentation of our report in C-10 to say that. And Laura, I mean, you know, how discoverability works isn't what Michael assumes is the only model. It can be promoting, finding these young talents and supporting them and helping them. So if YouTube wants to create studios or find ways to support this talent, and it is about money, because how do they get promoted if nobody's promoting them? So the idea isn't to limit them to Canada. The intent, like we did with radio and giving profile to Canadian artists, is to showcase them, not just to Canada, but to the rest of the world.
I don't know how many people you spoke to in the BTLR that actually make a, one sec. I don't know how many people in the BTLR you spoke to that actually make a living doing this, but there are already hundreds and frankly, thousands of Canadians that are doing this. The idea that, oh, we need them to set up studios, so maybe we'll get these creators, they're there. And we've got the legacy cultural lobby, these longstanding lobby groups saying, because you're successful, we now need YouTube to help fund us to help create some of this stuff. This is just simply not true. Why didn't the committee hear from these people? Did you hear from them as part of this? Did you bring in the various creators that have millions of viewers, subscribers around the world that make full-time livings and are not asking for any of this? They frankly just want the government to get out of the way.
Can I just 10 seconds, Byron? I promise.
No, we're going to move on to the next one. We're going to move on to the next one. We've only got about 5 minutes, and there's other good questions here. We have an embarrassment of riches and good questions and good commentary from you, but we're going to move on. The next question is, if the goal is to make big tech pay, and it is tangential to the previous question, if the goal is to make big tech pay, why is discovery included in the bill? I think making them pay almost everyone agrees with, but why give discovery to the CRTC?
Because
So I was just going to say, Daniel, you've been quiet for the last few minutes? Why don't you
yeah, there was an opportunity to argue with Michael about who knows best, but I wouldn't dare do that. The CRTC has traditionally done exhibition requirements for traditional television. Obviously, that's not appropriate in an on-demand environment. And so we're talking about shelf space. We're talking about saying, here's what's going on from Canadian content. And when you're scrolling through your list of options, here are some options that you can choose or not choose for that matter. And this is why the kind of walled garden analogy doesn't work. I think that weaponizing or there's a lot of innuendo and there's a lot of assumptions about the absolute worst possible thing that could ever happen. And it's true, we should protect against the worst possible things that could ever happen. But the idea that discoverability, saying that when you're open Netflix on your television and you have a list of options arrayed for you, and that there could be some of them from Canada, or frankly on YouTube that when you have a variety of recommendations that some of them could be from Canada, that this is somehow prescriptive or the government telling you what to watch, I find to be a bit of a stretch. There are, as Michael and Laura correctly pointed out, thousands and thousands and thousands of creators in Canada. YouTube or Netflix, for that matter, could choose from any one of them based on any consideration they like and still satisfy that discoverability requirement. So all we're talking about is shelf space, is an option for you to consider. And as we talked about with music, and as we've talked about with television, it turns out that when given those options to consider, Canadians choose them freely in many cases. And that's why shows like Kim's Convenience have been very popular recently. But those shows are made because, the CBC, for example, has very high Canadian content obligations. People don't have to watch it. They choose to.
Laura?
I think this actually gets at my 10-second point from before, so it's good. I think, to your point previously, Janet, and to your point, Daniel, if it is about money, then let's spend the money and let's get those people online and help them build content. That's not discoverability. That's very different.
No, we're aware of that. Yeah, they're different things.
Hang on. Give me a second. It is not the same as saying, which Heritage has clearly said to me in conversations, what's so wrong with 1 in 5 videos being Canadian that people have to see or that is suggested to them? And we think of it from our context, right? Like, okay, sure, 1 in 5 videos to us is suggested to be Canadian. That's one way to go about it. There's a million ways you can talk about discoverability. The fact they haven't clarified what it is, I think, is actually one of the biggest concerns, because we do have to guard against the worst case scenarios.
Right.
But again, we're coming at this from such a myopic Canadian view. Where do the rest of our audiences come from? What happens if the US says 1 in every 5 videos has to be American that you see? And France says that 1 in every 5 videos you have to see has to be French. And all of a sudden, where does that go for our export of content? Really normalizing the idea that you have to have this nationalistic perspective on what is your culture that you're exposed to. Again, perpetuating this belief that everyone deserves their own walled garden. And I have nothing wrong with finding Canadian content, making sure that it's available. I think it's great to be able to find local content. I agree with you, Daniel. People will watch it. People like it. I don't think Canadian content is something to be embarrassed about. I think that our creators make amazing content on the internet, but I think this idea that you're going to force feed it to people really disempowers users.
But
give people the choice to pick what they want. Give them the
But
ability to
nobody
filter
forced-
through.
But that's what we're
forced
talking
me.
about. That's what we're talking about. No one wants to force feed anything. It is exactly a choice, and I always welcome further definition. You're right. There's a lot of latitude for the CRTC here, but terms like walled garden, like the licensed broadcasting system that we've had historically, walled garden, absolutely. Requiring large companies that are broadcasting over the internet to contribute and be subject to certain regulations is not a walled garden at all. There's an infinite number that can come in, and these types of terms are really misleading and I think skew the public debate. There's another one, Byron, you mentioned link licensing earlier, right? What's been done in Australia has been referred to by the good professor, Mr. Geist, by open media as a link tax, for example. That's a phrase with two words. Tax goes to the government. The Australian model does not see any money go to the government, and link suggests that it's like Laura was saying, the more people see it, the more people click, the more money they get paid. That's not actually how the Australian system works. What's being proposed in Australia is that there will be a lump sum payment directly from a platform to publishers and broadcasters. And if you listen to the Australian Competition Commissioner, Rod Sims, he's spoken very eloquently about it. It is not a fee for content link by link. It is a payment recognizing the size and nature of these platforms makes it impossible for anybody else to have a viable digital advertising business. And if the consequence is the loss of journalism, that consequence is unacceptable. And so they've mandated these payments. So it's not a link, and it's not a tax. You can disagree, and Laura's point about hitching the wagon to the fortunes of these companies is a very valid one. I think that's the most valid critique of what's been done in Australia.
Daniel,
but it's not a tax, and it doesn't apply to links. These misleading terms don't help us assess the issues on their merits.
Daniel, thank you very much. Michael, I'm going to give you 1 minute because our event is winding down. So 1 minute, and then Janet, final comment from you.
Okay, so quickly, I mean, what happened in Australia is this is a battle between just giants, right? This is Rupert Murdoch on the one side, Mark Zuckerberg on the other. Let's not pretend that this is anything other than that. And it's home court for Murdoch, and so the Australian government went to bat for him. But more importantly, on discoverability, this shelf space on the internet. Seriously, this is the premise upon which we're going to have this kind of discoverability regulations. There is no shelf space issue. There is unlimited shelf space on all of these services. There is no chat, and there is not. So the idea that we need to reserve shelf space is simply untrue. And frankly, the idea that we need to require these sorts of discoverability requirements, I'd love to see some evidence for it, because when I read Janet's report on it, the only thing they were able to come up with was two outdated reports, two older reports, neither of which made the case that there is a discoverability problem. And I'd encourage, frankly, anybody on this call, you want to know if there's a discoverability problem, go on Netflix, type in Canada, tell me if you can find some Canadian content. And the idea that somehow it's in Netflix or YouTube's interest to hide Canadian content from you, that might have been the broadcaster interest because they had a regulatory requirement. So they stuck the Canadian programs at times when people weren't watching because they had to meet their obligation, and the US content was more profitable. If you're Netflix, you live and die by your subscribers. And if your Canadian subscribers want to see Canadian content, then you better well make it available to them and prominent. That's why their algorithms will ensure that you find the Canadian content if you demonstrate regularly that that's what you look for. And that's why, with respect, companies like Netflix and Amazon actually pay for Canadian content, not because they're trying to forestall regulation, but because perhaps there are Canadian users that want it, and they're in the business of satisfying their users, not satisfying regulatory edicts from the CRTC.
Thank you, Michael. Janet, final word from you.
Yeah, I'm going to say,
1 or 2 minutes,
first of all,
please.
no, Michael, you and I fundamentally disagree about what discoverability does and doesn't mean. I'm more with Laura on this issue. The ability to discover isn't interfering with algorithms. It's about promotion, not about shelf space. It's about making sure that these things are promoted. Your point that if people watch it, it'll get promoted is the catch-22 problem, because if people don't know it exists, then how do they find it? So the issue isn't interfering with algorithms. The issue is, how do we ensure that these are promoted? And I know you don't trust the CRTC to figure it out, but that is exactly the way it would have to work. The last thing I'll say is, Laura, while you prefer a tax and grant system for supporting the news, I have to tell you, that was the model that was recommended in our report, if you'll recall. And it was the thing that we were most criticized for because of the need to figure out who would get the money and how you would decide how to allocate the money, which is why I've now changed my view from a tax and grant model to supporting news or supporting audio and audiovisual content. We said spending for media other than news. We said tax and grant for news. I now am convinced that tax and grant models, like you've noted, Laura, for the one that was already announced by the government, they just don't work. I'll leave it there.
I think
And
the
there,
only thing
I'm
I'll
gonna
add to
have
that
to-
is just they both require the government to define news in either case. They both have the same problem.
I have to call it there. Unfortunately, we're going to have to draw this to a close because we're at 3 o'clock. But hold on a second. Before we say farewell, I'm going to launch another poll with the same question from before to see if this panel has changed people's minds. While we do the poll, I would just like to take the time to say thank you all for joining this first Canadian IGF Talks event or session in 2021. And I would like to say a huge thank you to our 4 panelists. Like many people on this call, we probably sat through many panels where a lot of people agree. And I can safely say that was not the case with this panel. Our panelists are passionate, highly informed, and highly active, and it showed. And I just want to say thank you very much to Mr. Bernhard, Professor Geist, Ms. Tribe, and Ms. Yale for taking the time to share our thoughts with us today and to show us both how informed and how passionate they are about the key issues, our key digital issues in Canada today. So I just want to say thank you very much, panel. Awesome. It's been a wonderful discussion and great to listen to, and at times a challenge to moderate. So thank you. This is for everybody on the call. This is the first Canadian IGF talk session of the year. We'll be hosting more events like this in the fall. So be sure to follow at Canadian IGF on Twitter and Facebook to stay up to date. And thank you again to everybody in the audience. Can't wait to see you at the next session. And again, thank you to the panel. That was fantastic. Much appreciated. Have a great day, folks. Bye for now.